We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we're going to be talking Department of Education, Deep State, the upcoming Trump administration, and a whole lot more. One of the biggest announcements out of the nascent Trump administration is that the Department of Education is on its last legs and may soon be out the back door. Now, what does that mean for education in America? What does it mean for economics? Well, we're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's economics guru, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. It's been a while.
It has. Well, we've had, what was in the way? Well, there's an election. We've got that out of the way, though.
The World Series.
The World Series, that was an important thing. I mean, that football that they keep throwing. I'm kidding, of course. But yes, so economics. Let's talk about the election very briefly. I think everybody was surprised to find that much like every other election in recent history, it was all about the economy. So, certain people, let's be fair, certain people were surprised to find that out, namely those that thought Kamala Harris would win on the back of the current economy. What's your take on that?
Well, I looked at the exit polling that night. It all came out from NBC News to CNN, and they all showed the exact same thing. The number one issue, for the most part, was the economy. And number two, they all said the same thing. My financial situation is worse than it was 4 years ago, even during the height of the coronavirus pandemic. So it was still the economy, stupid. And it should be very interesting over the next 4 years if Trump can really turn things around. Because he said, for example, he's going to slash energy prices in half. So gasoline is now going to cost you, a buck or two. Less than $2 at the pump. So it should be very fascinating to watch because you have to balance between supply-demand dynamics, regulations, and just, government spending, which that's one thing I'm definitely skeptical that's not going to be touched.
Yes, we'll see how that goes out. I mean, that's a big economic promise there, is being able to cut government spending. And as you've pointed out many times on this show and in your articles, your superb economics coverage on pages of libertynation.com, that most of the spending is not a discretionary spend anyway. So there's almost, unless there's major legislative shift, there's really no way to cut 2/3 of the spending anyway. So any savings will have to come from that remaining third. But we shall see. Now, it seems to me that Donald Trump's ready to take a weed whacker to certain departments, much in the fashion of Argentina's Javier Milei, who decided to cut most of the government departments down, and apparently the country's still working. But the one I specifically want to talk about, Andrew, is the Department of Education. Now, there's a huge amount of pearl clutching across the Fourth Estate, legacy media, and social media to some degree, although less so on social media. And this is because people seem to be under the idea that education in America won't exist without the Department of Education. Care to educate me on that a little bit?
Oh, boy. So, the United States did not have a Department of Education until 1979 under Jimmy Carter. The United States before then was ranked one of the top countries in the world when it came to education. Why? Because there was such a focus on the basics of reading, writing, math. Today, the United States is one of the worst of the OECD countries, despite spending virtually higher than all OECD countries. So let's look at some of the numbers, for example. Our great Kelly Ballard, she's crunched the numbers for LibertyNation.com, and she looked at the ranking systems of OECD countries using ISA, the Program of International Standard Assessment. And the numbers are horrible. So in math, the U.S. ranked 28th out of 37 OECD member countries. In science, the U.S. ranked 12th out of 37. And the public also doesn't hold a positive view either. I think Pew Research, they did a study this past spring, and they said that, people think two-thirds of the people think the U.S. education system is average or below average. And this is despite the government spending $1 trillion a year on K-12 schools, and which is about $17,000 per pupil. You look at the number OECD averages, the average is about $10,000. So the U.S. is spending more than South Korea, spending more than Canada, spending more than most of Europe, and it's still it's producing putrid results. So where's all this money going to? Guess what? Administrators.
I mean, that seems to be the overarching issue with it. There's a heavy batch of administration that's creating a very much top-down approach. And, when Donald Trump announced this earlier this week via a video, because, of course, that he put out on social media, because it's Donald Trump, that's how he's going to do things. The first thing that popped into my mind, and you might be familiar with this, but have you heard of the Needham question? Needham. Okay, so there was a professor, a British professor, decades ago, 1930s, and Joseph Needham, and he went to China, and he discovered all these. He started digging into the history of invention. Now, China used to be one of the most inventive countries in the world. I mean, pretty much everything that shaped the modern world came from China, but then it stopped. It completely stopped dead, and they didn't invent anything, and they still don't really invent anything. Sure, there's some improvements here and there. A lot of people question where that intellectual property might come from, but they stopped being an inventive country, and this became the Needham question. Why did they stop? And for me, the most convincing answer is that there was bureaucracy from the Mandarins, the Chinese Mandarins, across all levels of society. So if somebody wanted to try something new or wanted to head out on an adventure, perhaps, to go and find new lands, they had to go through this bureaucratic hierarchy. Now, everything had to be administered the same, and that was how the Mandarin system worked. So rather than somebody sticking their head out, as the saying goes, it's the nail that sticks out that gets hit with the hammer. These people kept their heads down and just denied everything. And so nothing new or inventive was allowed to happen. Now, let me pull that back to the Department of Education. America is, what do they call it, 50 petri dishes of democracy. But it's also 50 petri dishes of education. And so when things are left to the states, sure, there's certain things that, parents would expect and society would expect schools to teach, as you pointed out, reading, writing, math. But when everything is from a top-down bureaucratic structure, that means that there's very little innovation in terms of education. And I think that's why education has suffered since the inception of the Department of Education. What's your thought on that?
Okay, so there's three things I want to touch upon here. Okay, so you talk about the Needham question. That reminded me of a book by Michio Kaku called Physics of the Impossible. And he delved into a chapter exactly about this, about how China, how they were a really scientifically advanced country, and then they traveled west to Europe, and they saw the Middle Ages of they were still practicing, religion, and they were still stuck in the doldrums of a lack of scientific advancement. And they said, what's going on here? How come we have all this advancement, but they don't? And then they traveled back to Asia, and they just isolated themselves, and they embraced the same practices as Western Europe of not focusing on science. Number two, you talk about the top-down approach. You see the numbers, and they're very fascinating, because if you look at the numbers, you see student enrollment is actually on the decline. You see teacher, the number of new teachers joining the workforce, pretty much flat. And then you see administrators just rocketing out of nowhere. I think last time I saw was about 81% over the last 20 years. Now, one of the reasons why I'm skeptical that this is going to happen, because since I was a kid, I'm 36, when I watched the Bush...
You're still a kid.
When I watched the 2000 election when I was, I think, about 12 years old, Bush ran on to abolishing the Department of Education. And what happened during his administration? You got no child left behind. And that was just one of the initiation to the lackluster education system. Now, onto the states thing. You look at this, there was a great report, a ranking system last year by the U.S. News and World Report, and it ranked Florida as the top state for education. And why is that? Because Ron DeSantis, he took all the wokeness out of the classrooms, and he put an emphasis back on reading, writing, and math. I'll use a personal anecdote. Here in Canada, we have a conservative government of Ontario, and they overhauled the education system by putting a focus on reading, writing, and math, and incorporating things like coding and data analysis for even first graders. My kids are on the public system, and despite my grievances with the whole government education, I've been pleased with what they have been learning so far. I was so worried that they were going to start learning about 2S LGBTQIAP+ plus nonsense, but so far it's been just focused on the basics of reading, writing, and math, and they've excelled so far. if I may say. They've been doing very well. Kudos to them.
Well, your kids are the super bright little twins, so they're amazing. And we know they'll excel in anything with those two. So, yeah, it seems to me that the more devolved the power is from a central thing, and that's probably true with almost every department. I mean, we've seen that the decision on abortion has gone back to the states, and despite the screeching and the thrust of really the Kamala Harris failed campaign to focus on a national system of that, it seems that people are happy that decisions are with the state. I mean, there were 8 abortion initiatives on the ballot. I think 7 passed. 10, and 7 passed. So people enjoy the freedom to make their choice on the decisions that matter to them. In terms of voting for certain measures. And if education is devolved back to the states, I can't see that as being something that is restrictive anymore. And I think we'll see a lot more experiments coming out for that. Now, we're going to be back with Andrew discussing the wider potential Trump economy after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.